Okay.
Hey guys, this is James, and I'm joined again by Garrett.
Hey guys.
Yeah, so we are actually going to try something a little bit different. We're not drinking any tea here. We're going to talk a bit about some Puerh topics. As you guys know, TeaDB.org is the main site for TeaDB, and we do release articles every other week. And so one article that I released, depending on when this episode aired, it was in sort of mid-September.
Right.
Was titled "The Western Pu'erh Scene is Really Dominated by Modern Young Pu'erh," and basically the gist of this article is I took basically what I interpreted as some of the most popular vendors around for Pu'erh specifically, and I looked at the teas they added in 2017. So for some vendors, it was a little bit unclear, so I may have excluded them, but a lot of the popular suspects like Yunnan Sourcing, White Tea, Tea Urchin, Essence of Tea, Bitter Leaf Tea, Farmer Leaf Tea, all those guys are on this sheet. And I basically separated it into different categories, one of them being young raw pu'erh, another being ripe, another being semi-aged, and then there's also aged, which was a very sad category because there was something like one or two teas from there.
Right.
And so I didn't even really talk about that category. So basically the findings of it was that 80% of the teas that I added were young raw pu'erh. So it was really heavily dominated by that.
Right. And I guess we just want to kind of like talk about and explore a little bit more about kind of like the thoughts that we had of kind of regards to this finding, whether or not because I know there's like some, like, you could say that maybe, oh, well, all these guys who are putting out the new stuff, it just really doesn't compare in these several ways to the old stuff. Ergo, it's like a completely different market, a completely separate one. I know when we were like reading comments on your website, there was, I think it was Peter or talked about the bifurcation of
That's
the market.
Right,
yeah. And kind of like separating, like it's kind of like a separate thing. In fact, let me just pull that up.
Yeah.
While we are here.
And real quickly, since we've been in Taiwan together and gone tea shopping out there, is this sort of trend of 80% young pu'erh, did we find that in Taiwan? And
I would say it was real. I would say, I don't know. It's difficult because there were some vendors who were doing kind of a real similar thing to what a lot of Western vendors like White to Tea or like Tea Urchin were doing with kind of a smaller cake and more boutique. Definitely, and they were kind of branding their spaces as these like places for young, hip, kind of like the millennials of the area going in and just plunking down some cash for like these kind of like rebranded traditional like the rebranding of like a traditional like Chinese item. So I would say, but for the most part, the ones that we were going to had a little more of the aged tea, like front and foremost, like front and ready to go.
Yeah. And maybe you could argue that's certainly what we gravitated towards because that's what I'm looking for.
Yeah.
But it seemed to be the case that like certain shops specialize in certain things. It'd be like you could go to a shop and they would mainly have like, factory semi-aged stuff.
Right.
You could go to a shop and it's mainly like Danker, white label type stuff. Who knows exactly how old it is. It's a little bit wet.
Questionable.
Yeah. Questionable. So maybe Garrett and I just gravitated towards these questionable shops. I don't know, but I agree with what Garrett said. The simple answer would be no. It's quite a bit different. Anyways, let's get Peter's comment uploaded up there. So the point I'm making is that like this trend isn't necessarily true in the Sinosphere, East Asia. It's a big place, and you'll have different trends in different areas. But in Taipei, at least, not so much the case.
Right.
Being the same as the West.
I would, yeah, and Taipei, I think there's also a much larger, a much more varied tea drinking culture, which is like obviously, guys, but I think there is something else that I kind of found when we were in Taiwan together was that there's this kind of idea about folks collectors from the mainland coming over to Taiwan and like kind of like buying out all of like the traditional stuff from the early 2000s, late 90s. So I would say that there is a little more I don't know, like I think there was a little more of like just kind of like lower end and white label stuff from what we were getting and what we were like being offered.
Yeah, I mean, it's cheaper than, like, we're not going to be buying, like, a 90s legit DAI 7542 that's in, like, the 4 figures USD. So, it's understandable. It's kind of what we're in the market for. And, like, the being that I referred to might be more people that are coming over from China or whatever, with a lot of money, might be more who are interested in sort of, like, these collection items that are famous and Taiwan has had a lot of it in the past, maybe not quite as much now. Anyways, we weren't even in the market for those things. So let's see.
Yeah. So Peter is saying that, so he kind of discussed a lot of what you were saying in terms of like price strategy, the differences between collectors of old and young teas, and the different variables related to them. And I'm like kind of thinking that I would agree with him in terms of like the having the market be kind of split into two, because there's just these vastly different kind of like supply chains for the like younger boutique people, versus the old stuff where you're always like, where's the value in the old stuff? Like I guess it would probably be in more of the more of that kind of like white label, that unknown market. Of course, then there's less of a collectability aspect. So depending on who you are and what your goals are.
Yeah, if you're a drinker versus collector, and sort of like the simplest terms.
Right, yeah. And the difference between, I guess I would say like, should we, how as like a collector in the Western market, how should we be like, should we be scared that there's like less of this like aged tea available, semi-aged? Should we be out in trying to like travel to Asia and to get connected to more of this aged tea, or would you be leaning towards like taking more gambles towards like this Western boutique stuff and having it in like your collection as an experiment to age?
So you're just talking about me personally, like would
Yeah.
I think what you and I have tended to do is to either go through Asia, because I've been there for the past few years, and so I've gotten teas, and you've been there as well.
Right.
So that certainly sucked up a fair amount of tea budget, and just through connections of people that are either based there or traveling through. So we've tended to try to go more direct to Taiwan or elsewhere, Taobao, stuff like that, because that's where there are sort of like the teas that suit our interest, being people that are not terribly into young raw pu'erh. So that's what at least I've done personally.
Sure, got it.
I mean, like, the boutique market sort of being, like, its own separate thing, that's a market that certainly people have access to some options out here in the West, quite a bit, if it's 80% young raw pu'erh.
Right.
So those people probably need to go through the extra steps a little bit less. I think the problem comes when you have someone that might not be going to Asia, might be a little bit less well connected, maybe they're interested in pu'erh, and so they get exposed to this whole side of pu'erh, but maybe they don't get quite as exposed to this other side, just because so much of the conversation and so much of the dialogue is focused on those boutique pu'ers. That's sort of like if I were to talk of myself sort of like in a big picture, that's sort of like the consumer base that I'd be most concerned about that might miss out. Maybe the young raw is tough on their stomach. It happens. Or maybe they just don't like it. Maybe they don't like something a little bit more aged, a little bit more smooth, a little bit more fermented, which I think we both found is the case for us.
Right.
So that person that doesn't necessarily have a T-blog or TeaDB or something may just be completely unaware of this category of tea and not learn about it. And that's not to say that these teas are totally unavailable from Western vendors.
Right.
You can find them and you can buy them, just that the options are limited, and it tends to not take up a huge portion of what people are talking about and what people are selling.
Right. And I guess to kind of go back to what we were saying earlier about the difference in our experiences when we were in Taipei in terms of having these kind of like newer vendors who were definitely marketing towards a younger crowd. They had kind of like these really swanky spaces with like very kind of modern looking pu'er that was more like graphically designed on like the wrapper, and much smaller being I would say that I think there'll be a continuation of this kind of like, it's either this like really modern thing, or we're gonna go for the stuff that's really aged, and we're gonna have our brand be this like kind of like semi-aged or aged kind of thing, and so the culture in the West, I feel like, is going to be something where people are either going to kind of have to either choose their experience based on their like access to Asia, their access to and their comfort level with like exploring stuff that is new to them, stuff that is like either uncomfortable for them, and I think it'll just kind of like feed itself. Like the vendors will create a culture, and the culture in the West for kind of like branding and having like this image will feed that kind of like the younger and boutique crowd more.
White tea perhaps being the most obvious example in the West.
Yeah, and I really enjoy like his branding strategy and stuff, and the ideas behind kind of how he kind of takes like a hands-off approach in terms of like being explicit about like tree age or what the specific blend is going in. I think that's like that conscious move towards being like, all right, what matters really in terms of when you're drinking pu'er and when you're drinking tea. It's like the available experience at the point when you're drinking it, instead of like, oh, this is like this red ribbon cake from 2002 that I'm like super stoked about. I dropped $1,000 to get. I have all this like back knowledge, so it's like you're already drinking the tea before you're drinking it. So I think the hype in a lot of the aged and traditional aged market might be a little unsettling for folks, and be like, I just don't want to, like, it's too intimidating, and I don't want to go into that because it's expensive too.
Right. Yeah, and I think there's a lot of reasons for it on a sort of a vendor level why this sort of split has happened. Specifically, I think for someone like White Tea, you could look at it, and he actually has historically offered some sort of like unknown white label teas,
right.
Such as the 1990s Hong Kong style stuff like the White Whale, famously. And I think there's a real challenge with these teas because they're not for the faint of heart. They offer unfamiliar experiences, perhaps. He can't say exactly where it's from. So frankly speaking, it could just be a huge pain in the ass to sell these teas to a Western audience that is maybe more about like, oh, I want this, I want to know where it's sourced, blah, blah, blah. there could be a couple, maybe it's like 2 out of 100 people that bought it are asking like a ton of questions that just makes it hard. You might have to refund it. Refunding to China is probably not what he wants to be doing. So maybe at a certain point he's just like, oh, screw it. I'm going to sort of pursue this sort of like boutique, cute marketing, modern marketing approach, and just go on about the young tea because it's not worth my trouble to do it for these older teas. There's also the fact of the matter that he can go to Yunnan, and maybe part of this is just sort of like the romantic notion of like, hey, I can go to Yunnan, I can meet with the farmers, I can sort of mix up, I make my own blends of these tea, steam it together, put a cool wrapper that I designed on, and do that. And so he's getting it direct from the farmers. Whereas if you were to sort of source these older bings, like if you're sourcing like factory material that's sort of like of known origin, you have to have a lot of knowledge of like what you're sourcing. Or you could go the white label approach, but then you're sort of stuck with this sort of part of it is like, I'm not sure exactly how old this is. It's seen some humidity, which is kind of like an off-putting thing for Westerners to start off with. And so it's sort of a tricky and difficult selling point. Not to mention, he's going to have to go, like, the tea has probably changed hands. Not a lot of these Westerners, with Scott maybe being the obvious exception, have been, like, sourcing tea from China for 15 or 20 years. So they haven't exactly been sitting on these bings that they bought when it's much cheaper. So he probably has to buy it from someone else, which costs money, and so the tea ends up being marked up more than it would be otherwise. So, anyways, that's kind of all over the place, but it's a few of the reasons that I perceive, at least, as reasons why a Western vendor may choose to just say, fuck it, I'm going to go to Yunnan, I'm going to press this stuff, I'm going to get the connections, this is how I'm going to do business and make money. I'm sort of a late arriver. This is what makes the most sense for me.
Yeah, and there's more control there too, and the ambiguity isn't there, which adds ambiguity for like the person doing the sourcing, as well as ambiguity for the customer who would want to buy the tea from the person doing the sourcing. So it's like, how do you bridge that with customers, and how do you bridge that with like making sure that you have enough supply to meet the demand of customers? It might be that the demand isn't there too for a lot of these, as you were saying, like the age stuff can be very like disconcerting for somebody starting out, especially somebody who's probably used to more of a Western style cuisine,
and how sort of compatible that is with like what people in the West are looking for. It could be, maybe there's a disconnect there. I don't know. Personally, I think that it's more that it depends which way you're looking at, like the chicken and the egg. Personally, I think there is more of a market out there for these semi-aged teas, and maybe it's just not being, maybe people are just not being exposed to it. It's some speculation on my part, sure, but that would be what my intuition would say.
I would say, too, that I guess there's this idea that when you're buying from a boutique vendor, maybe they have less experience pressing cakes versus like the factory, which even if the material's lesser quality, they have a ton of experience. They have the heritage related to blending and pressing. So you should always just head for the factory because it's the most consistent. And that kind of brings us back to another comment that was on your specific article.
So Garrett is referring to, I think, comments by KYF, who commented both on this one as well as a more recent article I did, kind of in the same vein, on big factory recipes and price. We were thinking about talking about it today. I don't think we're going to get to it. And he basically has more of a perspective that is kind of the opposite of someone that's arguing in favor of these boutiques. He's arguing more in favor of factories. He made sort of an analogy with cars. Cars are not really my thing, so I only partially got the analogy. But he basically is saying that, a place like Dai has the connections, and they are the ones that press good tea. They are the ones that know what the hell they're doing.
Right.
They have been doing this for a very long time. Why a lot of these Westerners don't really know what they're doing, or he calls them, I think, moonshiners. So I think it's I don't buy totally into his comments, but I think there is truth there, and I do tend to lean somewhat to his side. I think he's right for sure that Dai, when they want to, can press some extremely good tea and have access to really good leaves. But I think, I'm curious what you would have to say before I go on my rant.
Yeah. Well, I guess there are also two different populations that they're serving. Because like modern factory productions now, I think are geared to more of this daily drinker, who maybe doesn't care or cares less about collecting for like the long term and just wants like that rough.
So you're talking about sort of Westerners that might buy a young pu'erh?
I'm talking about Westerners, but also maybe even some of the kind of casual drinkers that are in the East.
Okay, that are drinking young pu'erh?
That are drinking factory pu'erh.
Okay. Oh, factory. Okay.
So like the factory pu'erh, I feel like it's like this entry point that's they want to keep it, I feel like, on the cheaper end versus kind of maybe some of their like other stuff that you could find on the market. So like your semi-aged or your like very aged pu'erh tea is much more expensive. So it's not something you would maybe necessarily, depending on who you are and what your budget is, it's not something that you would break into on the daily. But the factories, I think, have a different population they serve versus these boutique guys who are, I feel like a lot of them are geared towards more of a Western audience. They're looking for the person who is maybe more of a solitary drinker. So like in terms of like cake size, that would be something that would serve their needs probably even better than like a 400 gram.
Yeah, and I mean we've certainly noticed that, right?
Right.
I mean the amount of small cakes made for young raw pu'erh there's quite a lot. Yeah.
Yeah. So the difference of customers and difference of populations served for both of these folks too, I think, has to be considered when you're comparing whether or not like do you choose the consistency of a factory tea over the maybe a slightly more risk over with a boutique vendor who's recently pressed like this really high quality or supposedly high quality.
Yeah. I think KYF would say it's not
high quality.
It's green tea.
So supposed high quality tea, I think it's comes down to kind of like where those companies are and like who they're trying to serve.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I think Garrett's point is well taken. Dai serves a big audience, and there might be an incentive to make really fancy premium tea. Mm-hmm. But the fact of the matter is, most of their market is not quite that. Right. They're making a lot of ripe tea. They're making tea. They're making tea for the masses. They make a lot of tea. Their productions are extremely big sizes. How much of that sway should be invested in sort of like making these more primo type stuff? I don't know. It probably depends. They certainly could if they wanted to, I'm sure. But I mean, I think the other fact of the matter is that like a lot of people are drinking these boutique young pu'erhs pretty early right. in the West and otherwise. There's a selection of drinkers that are buying, a lot for the long haul. Some are buying a little for the long haul, and some are buying not at all for the long haul. And I think most people probably fall into that last bucket. It's a little bit of speculation on my part, but it's a lot to ask people to invest both storage space and sort of these things sort of at this like 10, 15 year aging experiment minimum.
Right, and it truly is an experiment for somebody in the West too.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Different topic for a different day.
Yes.
Yeah. So, any closing thoughts?
I think we covered a lot. And I got most of my thoughts out there, so I think I'm good.
Yeah, well, thank you, Garrett, for appearing and having this open-ended conversation. Let me know, guys, how you like this episode, if you like this format. Garrett and I are open to doing a few more of these if it's something you're interested in. A little poo nerdy up in here, talking about some of these things. Check out those articles if you haven't already, TeaDB.org. Titled "The Western Pu'erh Scene is Really Dominated by Modern Young Pu'erh." There's a bunch of comments on there that are well worth reading. Some people falling in on both sides of the argument there. And to be clear, it was not intended to demonize Western vendors, merely to observe sort of this trend and think and open up the discussion on what that means for vendors, what that means for consumers. So thank you guys for tuning in, and cheers.
Cheers.